The incredible history behind the 1943 steel cent is the reason that I'm making this video today. There are some that are worth hundreds of thousands or even millions, but there are many, many more that just serve as fascinating examples of how our US money has evolved over time. And so today I'm going to be explaining just what went on in 1943 that we got these pennies made out of steel. Super interesting, especially now that we're not even making the penny anymore. It's crazy to say that. But then also getting into 10 examples of different small things and pretty obvious things that you can look for on your 1943 pennies to make sure that it's not one of the super valuable ones or one of the ones worth a few hundred or a few $1,000s. There's a lot more out there to look for than you might imagine, so I think we better get started. So let's dive into these top 10, and I couldn't resist. I had to put in a couple more than just 10. And so there's a couple tied for. In the first case, we're going to be looking at some of the double dies as well as repunched mint marks that you can look for. And there actually are more than what we're talking about here. So maybe another time I'll do like a full list. But in this instance, you can see doubling on the reverse. Basically, each die that strikes pennies would have been made in a die making process where it would have sometimes received multiple impressions that should have gone right on top of each other, but sometimes it's a little bit off. And so in this case, you can see a little bit of shelving where that die was produced in a way that has some doubling both in the letters, so this is like in the United States of America, but there's a lot of extra thickness in the E pluribus and some of the other letters as well. These are way, way, way thicker letters than normal. And so it's challenging to find it in too low of grades, but for a Mint State 65, which normally is not a particularly expensive coin, it'll quickly jump to about $750, as there's a lot of people who want to put together a fun set, especially as a historic coin such as the 1943. When we jump to the San Francisco Mint, there's also going to be a double die on the obverse, and there's some recent numismatic scholarship that actually came out and showed that this is a 1943 over a 2. So it's an overdate. You can see the outline faintly of a 2 underneath, kind of trace along where I'm showing my mouse. The 2 would have stuck out on the right upper side of the 3, and then a bit under on that bar, there's that 2. Where then a 3 from that hub was struck directly over it. On the 1 and the 9 digits, there's going to be some clear doubling that shows some shelving in this inner loop of the 9, a little bit to the south. And again, great double die example worth, an AU55 43S is probably worth 50 cents, so it jumps to $75 really quickly. That's a nice step up and cool thing to find. But when you're able to find it on a Mint State 65, $1,000, it's a pretty significant number. And again, especially interesting with this new overdate. This is one of the more well-known repunched mint marks, super strong, effectively. Often the dies would have been struck without a mint mark at that stage. And so when they would arrive at the mint, say it gets sent from Philadelphia, goes out to Denver to strike coins, instead of having no mint mark, which would have meant Philadelphia, they would strike and they would literally stamp a D mint mark. But sometimes it wouldn't take that well. And so then they would stamp over it again. Often those are going to be pretty challenging to discern, but in this example, the repunching is way off significantly to the right and a little bit higher than the prior under D mint mark. And this is more valuable even in lower grades. So AU range is a $300 coin, and it tapers off a little bit. It's a lot of money to spend on a variety, but $1,000 in Mint State 65, and I think one of the must-have repunched mint marks. And I believe it was 1989 that they stopped doing that, so you can't find any repunched mint marks after that. 1943 itself, there is going to be another double die obverse. We talked about the 1943S, but in this case, you can see insane extra thickness all through the 1. There's like this spread, way, way, way thicker in the bottom shelf of the 9. And then same thing here, you can see the Liberty sort of dragging out, significantly more thickness on each of the letters. Very, very interesting. And again, quickly, it's a lot of where these end up is kind of $100 to $200 for the AU ranges, and then just shy or around $1,000 in Mint State. Then we're going to get to some of the bigger step up in value. This is a really interesting separate tied for 7th, which shows 5 different types that were all encapsulated at the same time by NGC that include a 1943 experimental planchet. They tested it, and I believe it was 90% zinc, with the remainder being split 4% antimony and 6% iron. And so it's not quite a new planchet type. It's very challenging to find any examples, but it originally sold for something like 180,000, was resold by Heritage for like 60 or 70, and then most recently dropped down to 31,000. That was alongside some blank planchet coins, and then this interesting 1943 or 1942 dated Judd proof zinc coated planchet, but it's of a different design, but more of a Liberty look as opposed to Abraham Lincoln. So that one's kind of fascinating. There's a couple of other off metal. Everybody talks about struck on a more traditional wrong planchet, but in this example, the Americans were striking 25-cent coins for the Netherlands at this time because they would have been occupied by Nazi Germany. And so for $24,000, this one came up. Somehow a cent was struck on a Dutch, and you can see the silver, I believe, undertype 25-cent planchet. So fairly expensive. And I've also seen silver pennies. So there's a lot of different things, but this is kind of one of the most unique and crazy Cuban 1 centavo coins. We were striking coins for Cuba. 1943 already gets struck. You can see clearly the undertype, 2.3 grams. I believe it would have been cupro nickel, Patria y Libertad, so clear. And it's that nickel is a strong metal, so it's going to actually not go away as easily when struck. And you still get the In God We Trust, you still get Lincoln. So it's super interesting from that perspective. The most recent strike is that 1943, and this was plucked out of circulation quickly. Some of the other ones do make their way and circulate for a little bit, but this one sold for about $38,000, and it's one of my favorite error coins and overstrikes anywhere, especially since it happened on the 1943. But we're now going to get into different 1943 and 1944 steel and copper planchets. So 44 is one of the most common types of the wrong metal. In 1943, they should be struck out of steel. In 1944, they should be struck in bronze. However, there were some mix-ups that happened. There were many, many blank planchets left over from 1943 that ended up getting between the dies in 1944 and struck here. And so this one is, again, a nice example, but probably the most common. You can go out there and own one of these. I feel like they've gone even cheaper in like the $20,000, $30,000 range. But for a nice mint state example, you're looking right around 6 figures. That's going to be a little bit of a step up when we get to the 1944 D Lincoln set. And one really nice thing is that Simpson was a collector who was able to acquire all of the different types of varieties. There are about 7 of these known, and the rarity corresponding is a little bit more, not crazy more, but again, you're seeing a step. If we go back, 40 goes to 45,000 and about uncirculated, then about 100,000 increases about 25% when we're looking at the Denver mint mark. 1943 S Lincoln cents are also, and it's always interesting from a collector perspective because kind of the most iconic is going to be just 1943 plain. So generally, like when we look at the 1909 Lincoln cent, the S mint is going to be a key date that's even rarer and much more expensive. And in this, I feel like that's probably the case, honestly, in a lot of ways here. But this is about $150,000 worn, up to $750 for a mint state example. And there are approximately 5 of these known. And so there's not a huge difference between these and then something like the 1943. Outside of, and when we look at the prices, there might be a little more strength in that AU range. 1943 is rumored to have about 10 to 15 pieces existing, and there's some that are worse, but I felt like it was just so iconic that it kind of had to get that number 3 spot. You could probably make an argument for switching the 3 and the 4 here. Anyways, this is kind of the original off planchet. It would have, I believe, came out later that there were the S mint or the D mint examples, and there would have been just so many millions of these struck in the regular steel that for an old 1942 bronze composition planchet to end up getting struck was pretty significant and quite exciting to collectors. Then we get to some of the most expensive real rarity types. So 1944S for the 44s is the rarest. There's only 2 of them known. This is probably the nicest of the off metal at Mint State 66, sold for about $500,000. And I could see it, going for higher today. All it takes is 2 collectors that really want to, do what Simpson at one point did. And because of Simpson, we have the most expensive, the 1943D Lincoln Cent. And it's the only one of these that is entirely unique. So Simpson, I believe, had paid about $1.7 million for it, rumored about 10, 15 years ago now. And so that set a price record for this type. I love on it how there's these little specks. I can't tell if those are like a little bit of the maybe steel left over that was still between the dies that it would have gotten from hitting into a bunch of proper steel planchets that was then left and restruck onto this 1943D. But when it came up to auction, it actually only sold for about $840,000 in a heritage sale. But you can see, and they're only qualified offers, that from that page on Heritage, there have been offers to date of up to 1.5 million that have gone unaccepted. So that means presumably that somebody's maybe even in the market to make a record purchase. And you could see how whoever most recently bought it for 840 might be able to have a nice return on their money selling it for, call it, 1.5 or $2 million, or maybe even more, because if there's 2 people that want to put together the set of the PDS 43 bronzes and 44 steel cents, they're going to have to buy this one. And so it really makes it a choke point of era and World War II era collecting. So anyways, hope that this was a helpful and informative video. I should probably, now I'm thinking, make a video that's more of the, hey, do I have one of these? Because I've seen many, discolored 1944s. There, people will try and go alter the date. There's all kinds of challenging things when tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars are involved that people will do to try to deceive. But it's also plausible that 1 or 2 of these is still floating around out there. Every once in a while, there's a big find that somebody makes, and it makes the coin news. And so it's thanks to coin enthusiasts like yourself that we get to continue having those stories, and it would be awesome if Treasure Town could be part of one of them sometime in the future. I'll see you on the next videos as I try to keep demystifying, so to speak, many of these great American coin treasures. Thanks for watching the video. Make sure to head on over to treasuretown.com and sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything that's happening, whether it's auction updates, exciting new inventory drops, coin collecting news, or general informational resources. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on another one.